Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books out loud while stoned. Today we're going to do part 2 of Little Blue Book number 66, titled Crimes of the Borgias, written by Alexander Dumas, edited by H.M. Tichenor. Alrighty, here we go. Let's see. Okay. One evening, the Archbishop of Cosenza was Cardinal Valentino came into his prison. One evening, the Archbishop of Cosenza saw Cardinal Valentino come into his prison with that frank air of affability which he knew well how to assume when it could serve his purpose. He explained to the prisoner the embarrassing situation in which the Pope was placed, from which the Archbishop alone, whom His Holiness looked upon as his best friend, could save him. The Archbishop replied that he was entirely at the service of His Holiness. Then appeared Caesar Borgia. Caesar Borgia, on his entrance, found the prisoner seated, leaning his elbow on a table, and took a seat opposite him and explained the Pope's position. It was an embarrassing one. At the very time of contracting so important an alliance with the House of Aragon as that of Lucrezia and Alfonso, His Holiness could not avow to Ferdinand and Isabella that, for the sake of a few miserable ducats, he had signed a dispensation that would unite in the husband and wife together all the legitimate claims of a throne, to which Ferdinand and Isabella had no right at all but that of conquest. This vow would necessarily put an end to all negotiations, and the pontifical house would fall by the overthrow of that very pedestal, which was to have heightened its grandeur. Accordingly, the Archbishop would understand what the Pope expected of his deposition and friendship. It was a simple and straight vow that he had supposed he might make it upon himself to accord the dispensation then, as the sentence to be passed on such an error would be the business of Alexander. The accused could easily imagine beforehand how truly paternal such a sentence would be. Besides, the reward was in the same hands, and if the sentence was that of a father, the recompense would be that of a king. In fact, this recompense would be no less than the honor of assisting an envoy, with the title of cardinal, at the marriage of Lucrezia and Alfonso, a favor which would be very appreciative, since it would be thanks to his devotion that the marriage could take place. The Archbishop of Cosenza knew the men he was dealing with. He knew that to save their own ends they would hesitate at nothing. He knew they had a poison like sugar to the taste and to the smell. He knew they had a poison like sugar to the taste and to the smell, impossible to discover in food, a poison that would kill slowly or quickly as the poisoner willed, and would leave no trace behind. He knew the secret of the poison, kept that lay always on the Pope's He knew the secret of the poison kept that lay always on the Pope's mantelpiece. At that, when His Holiness wished to destroy someone of his intimates, he bade him to open a certain cupboard. On the handle of the key there was a little spike, and as the lock of the cupboard turned stiffly, the hand would naturally press. The lock would yield, and nothing would have come of it but a trifling scratch. The scratch was mortal. He knew, too, that Caesar Borgia wore a ring made like two horn heads, and that he would turn the stone on the inside when he was shaking hands with a friend. Then the lion's teeth became the teeth of a viper, and the friend died cursing Borgia. So he yielded, partly through fear, partly blinded by the thought of the reward, and Caesar returned to the Vatican armed with precious paper in which the Archbishop of Cosenza admitted that he was the only person responsible for the dispensation granted to the royal nun. 2 days later, by means of the proof kindly furnished by the Archbishop, the Pope, in the presence of the governor of Rome, the auditor of the apostolic chamber, the advocate, and the fiscal attorney, pronounced sentence condemning the Archbishop to the loss of all his benefices and ecclesiastical offices, degradation from his order, and confiscation of his goods. His person was to be handed over to the civil arm. Then, 2 days later, the civil magistrate entered the prison to fulfill his office as received from the Pope and appeared before the Archbishop, accompanied by a clerk, 2 servants, and 4 guards. The clerk unrolled the paper he carried and read the sentence. The 2 servants untied a packet and stripped the prisoner of his ecclesiastical garments. They reclothed him in a dress of coarse cloth, which only reached to his knees, breeches of the same, and a pair of coarse shoes. Then the guards took him and led him onto one of the deepest dungeons of the castle of St. Angelo, where for furniture he found nothing but a wooden crucifix, a table, a chair, and a bed. For occupation, a Bible, and a breviary, with a lamp to read by. For nourishment, 2 pounds of bread and a small cask of water, which were to be renewed every 3 days, and a bottle of oil for burning. At the end of a year, the Archbishop died. He had gnawed his own arms in his agony and despair. The day of the Archbishop of Cosenza was taken into the dungeon, Caesar Borgia was presented by the Pope with all the belongings of the condemned victim. The hunting parties, balls, and feasts were tatting a second between Caesar and Donna Carlotta, Frederick's daughter. Wait, that can't be the right page. Is it? Nope, wasn't the right page. Okay. The hunting parties, balls, and feasts were not the only pastime enjoyed by the Pope and his family. From time to time, startling spectacles were exhibited. We will only describe 2. One of them a case of punishment, the other an exhibition of the stud farm. As both of these give details of which we would not have the reader credit our imagination, we will state that they are translated from Bucard's Latin Journal. About the same time, that is, about the beginning of 1499, a certain courtesan named La Corsetta was in prison, and had a lover who came to visit her in woman's clothes, a Spanish Moor, called from his disguise the Spanish lady from Barbary. As a punishment, both of them were led through the city, the woman without petticoat or skirt, but wearing only the Moor's dress, unbuttoned down the front. The man wore a woman's garb. His hands were tied behind his back, and the skirt fastened up to his middle, giving a complete exposure before the eyes of all. When in this attire they had make the circuit of the town, the Corsetta was sent back to prison with the Moor. But on the 7th day of April, the Moor was again taken out and escorted in the company of 2 thieves towards the Campo di Flori. The 3 condemned men were preceded by a constable who rode backwards on an ass and held in his hand a long pole, on the end of which was hung, still bleeding, the amputated limbs of a Jew who had suffered torture and death from a trifling offense. Wow. Then the procession reached the place of execution. The thieves were hanged, and the unfortunate Moor was tied to a stake, piled round with wood, where he was to have been burnt to death, had not rain fallen in such torrents that the fire would not burn in spite of the efforts of the executioner. This unlooked for happening, taken as a miracle by the people, robbed Lucrezia Borgia of the most exciting part of the spectacle prepared by her father, the Pope. But her father was holding in reserve another spectacle to console her. The few lines that we are about to set before the reader are a translation from the journal of Bucard, who saw nothing in the bloodiest or most wanton performances of the Borgias, but facts for his journal. On the 11th of November, a certain peasant was entering Rome with 2 stallions laden with wood. When the servants of His Holiness, just as he passed the piazza of St. Peter's, cut their girths, so that their loads fell onto the ground with the pack saddles, and led off the horses to a court between the palace and the gate. Then the stable doors were opened, and 4 other stallions, free and unbridled, rushed out, and in an instant all 6 animals began kicking, fighting, and biting each other until several were killed. The Pope and Lucrezia, who sat at the window just over the panel palace gate, took great delight in the fight and called their courtiers to witness the battle being fought below them. Caesar's trick in this matter of the Archbishop of Cosenza had the desired result, and Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain could no longer impute to Alexander the signature of the brief they had complained of. So nothing was now in the way of the marriage of Lucrezia and Alfonso. This gave the Pope great joy, for he attached all the more importance of this marriage because he was already cogitating, cogitating a second between Caesar and Donna Carlotta, Friedrich's daughter. Caesar had shown in all his actions since his brother's murder his lack of vocation for the ecclesiastical life, so no one was astonished when the consistory, having been summoned one morning by the Pope, Caesar entered and addressing the Pope, began by saying that from his earliest years he had been drawn towards secular pursuits, both by natural inclination and ability, and it had only been in obedience to the commands of His Holiness that he entered the church. Accepting the cardinal's scarlet and other dignities, and finally the sacred order of the Diaconte, but feeling that in this situation it was improper to follow his passions, and at his age impossible to resist them, he humbly entreated His Holiness graciously to yield to the desires he had failed to overcome, and to permit him to lay aside the dress and dignity of the church and enter into the world, there to contract a lawful marriage. Also, he entreated the Lord Cardinals to intercede for him with His Holiness, to whom he would freely resign all his churches, abbeys, and benefices, as well as every ecclesiastical dignity and preferment that had been accorded him. The cardinals deferred to Caesar's wishes, gave a unanimous vote, and the Pope, like a good father, accepted his son's resignation. Thus Caesar Borgia put off the scarlet robe, which was suited to him, says the historian Tomasia, in one particular only. It was the color of blood. In truth, the resignation was a pressing necessity. Charles VIII of France, one day after he had come home, tired from the hunting field, had bathed his head in cold water, and going straight to the dining table, had been struck down by an apoplectic fit immediately after his meal, and was dead, leaving the throne of Louis the XII, a man of 2 conspicuous weaknesses. The first was the lust of conquest. The second was his desire to beget children. The Pope was on the watch for political changes, had seen what he could obtain from Louis XII's ascension to the throne, and was prepared to profit by the fact that the new king of France needed his help for the accomplishment of his twofold desire. First, Louis needed his temporal aid in an expedition against the Duchy of Milan. Secondly, Louis needed his spiritual aid to annul his marriage with Jeanne, daughter of Louis XI, a barren and deformed woman, whom he had married on account of his fear of her father. Now Alexander was willing to do all this for King Louis, and give, in addition, a cardinal's hat, to his friend D'Ambrose, provided that the King of France would use his influence to persuading Donna Carlotta to marry his son Caesar. It was Wednesday, the 18th of December, 1499, when Caesar Borgia entered the town of Chinon with pomp worthy the son of a pope, who is about to marry the daughter of a king. But all his pomp had no effect on the lady for whose sake it had been displayed, for when Donna Carlotta was told that Caesar Borgia had come to France in the hope of becoming her husband, she replied that she would never take a priest for a husband, and he, a son of a priest, a creature who had not only a murderer, but a fratricide, not only of infamous birth, but still more infamous in character and deeds. However, Caesar found another desirable princess who consented to be his wife, Mademoiselle d'Albert, daughter of the King of Navarre. Navarre. The news of this marriage, which made the coveted papal alliance with Louis XII, was received with great joy by the Pope. Shortly after this came the burning at the stake, the victims being charged with heresy of Girolamo Savonarola, Domenico Bonvinci, and Silvestro Maruffi. Pope Alexander VI, in his burning of Savonarola, set himself free from his own most formidable enemy and the best friend the people had. During the wars of Galupes and Ghibellines, and the long exile of the popes at Avignon, most of the towns and forests of the Romanage had been usurped by petty tyrants, who for the most part had received from the empire the investiture of their new possessions. But ever since German influence had retired beyond the Alps, and the popes had again made Rome the center of the Christian world, all the small princes, robbed of their original protector, had rallied round the papal see, and received at the hands of the Pope a new investiture, and now they paid annual dues, for which they received the title of Duke, Count, or Lord, and the name of Vicar of the Church. It had been no difficult matter for Alexander, scrupulously examining the actions and behavior of these gentlemen during the 7 years he had elapsed since he was exiled to St. Peter's throne, to find in the conduct of each one of them something that could be charged as an infraction of the treaty between vassals and suzerain. Accordingly, he brought complaints at a tribunal he had established for that purpose, and obtained sentences from the judges to the effect that the small princes were despoiled of their possessions, which should become the property of the Holy See, as the Pope found that he was now dealing with men against whom it was easier to pass a sentence than to get it carried out. He nominated a Captain General Caesar Borgia, who was now the Duke of Valentinos, and who was commissioned to take the territories. But the Duke of Valentinos, eager to keep his friendship with his ally and relative Louis XII, was staying with his royal friend in Milan, where, after a month's occupation, the king having departed for his own capital, the Duke of Valentino ordered his men-at-arms and his Swiss soldiers to await him between Parma and Modena, and departed post-haste for Rome, to explain his plans to his father and to receive his final instructions. When he arrived, he found that the fortune of his sister Lucrezia had been greatly augmented in his absence, not from the side of her husband Alfonso, but from his father's side, upon whom, in a natural way, she exercised an influence more astonishing than ever. The Pope had declared Lucrezia Borgia of Aragon life governor of Spolata and its duchy, with all emoluments, rights, and revenues according thereunto. This had so increased her position that she never showed herself in public without a company of 200 horses, ridden by the most illustrious knights and ladies of Rome. Moreover, as the double love of her father was a secret to nobody, the first prelates in the church, The frequenters of the Vatican, the friends of His Holiness, were all her most humble servants. Cardinals gave her their hands when she stepped from her litter on her horse. Archbishops disputed the honor of celebrating Mass in her private apartments, but Lucrezia had been obliged to quit Rome in order to take possession of her new estates, and as her father could not spend much time away from her, he determined to take into his hands the town of Nepi, which on a former occasion had been bestowed upon Asensio Sfosa. In exchange for his suffrage, Asensio had lost this town by attaching himself to the fortunes of the Duke of Milan, and now that the Pope was about to take it again, he incited Lucrezia to join him there and be present at the festivities in honor of his reassuming possession. Lucrezia's readiness to comply with her father's wishes brought her a new gift from him. This was the town and territory of Sermontia, which belonged to the Cantini. Of course, the gift was as yet a secret, because the two owners had first to be disposed of, one being Monsignor Giacomo Santanio, apostolic protonotary, the other Prospero Santano, a young cavalier. But as both lived at Rome and entertained no suspicion, but supposed themselves to be in high favor with His Holiness, the matter presented no difficulty to a Borgia. So immediately after the return of Alexander to Rome, Giacomo Sarantino was arrested on some pretext, taken to the castle of St. Angelo, and there died of poison. Prospero was strangled in his own house. The estates of both were confiscated and given to Lucrezia by the Pope. Another fortune had been making prodigious strides during Caesar's stay in France, viz., the fortune of Gian Borgia, the Pope's nephew, who had been one of the most devoted friends of the Duke of Gandia up to the time of his death. It was said in Rome that the young cardinal owed the favors heaped upon him by His Holiness less to the memory of the brother than to the protection of the sister. Both these reasons made Gian Borgia a special object of suspicion to Caesar Borgia, and it was with an inward vow that he should not enjoy his own dignities very long that the Duke of Valentinos heard that his cousin Gian had been nominated Cardinal Alatre of all the Christian world, and had quitted Rome to make a circuit through the pontifical states with a suite of archbishops, bishops, prelates, and gentlemen, such as would have done honor to the Pope himself. Caesar had only come to Rome to get news, so he only stayed 3 days, and then, with all the troops His Holiness could supply, rejoined his forces on the borders of Iuza and marched at once to Imola. Hydration. This town, abandoned by its chiefs, who had retired to Forli, was forced to capitulate. Imola taken. Caesar marched straight upon Forli. There he met with a serious check. A check, moreover, which came from a woman, Caterina Sfosa, widow of Girolamo and mother of Ottavio Rivero, had returned to this town and stirred up the courage of the garrison by putting herself, her goods, and her person under their protection. Caesar saw that it was no longer a question of a sudden capture, but of a regular siege, so he began to make all his arrangements with a view to it, and placing battery of cannon in front of the place where the walls seemed to him the weakest, he ordered an uninterrupted fire to be kept up until the breach was practicable. When he returned to camp after giving his order, he found that Gian Borgia, who had started for Rome from Ferrara and was unwilling to be so near Caesar without paying him a visit, He was received with effusion, and apparently the greatest joy, and stayed 3 days. On the 4th day, all the officers and members of the court were invited to a grand farewell supper, and Caesar bade farewell to his cousin, charging him with dispatches for the Pope, and lavishing upon him all the tokens of affection he had shown on his arrival. Cardinal Guillaume Borgia posted off as soon as he left the supper table, but on arriving at Urbino, he was seized with such a sudden and strange sickness that he was forced to stop. But after a short while, feeling somewhat better, he went on. Scarcely, however, had he entered Rocca Contrada, when he again became so ill that he resolved to go no further, and stayed there a couple of days. Then, as he felt a little better again, and as he had heard the news of the taking of Forli, and also the Katrina Stifosa had been taken prisoner, he resolved to go back to Caesar and congratulate him. But at Fossombrone he was forced to stop for a 3rd time. This was his last halt. 3 days later he was dead, another victim of the poison of the Borgias. Thus passed away those who were swept to destruction by the ambition of the terrible trio, Alexander, Lucretia, and Caesar. Almost at the same time, Rome was startled by another murder. Don Giovanni Sir Vigilone, a gentleman by birth and a soldier captain of the Pope's men-at-arms, was attacked at night by assassins. One of the men asked his name, and as he pronounced it, plunged a dagger through his heart, while a second, with a backstroke of his sword, cut off his head. The governor of Rome lodged a complaint with the Pope, but perceiving that he had better keep quiet concerning the assassination, he stopped all inquiries. It was said that Caesar Borgia had had a rendezvous with Sir Vigilone's wife, who was a Borgia by birth, and that her husband had threatened her and her lover. Another death followed quickly on that of Don Giovanni Sir Vigilone. Monsignor Angeli of Mantau, Archbishop of Cosenza, having fallen into disfavor with the Pope, was poisoned at his own table. His possessions were divided into 3 portions. The land and houses were given to Caesar Borgia, the bishopric to Francesco Borgia, and the office of clerk to the chamber was sold for 5,000 ducats, and the money handed over to the Pope. This last death served the purpose of determining a point of law hitherto uncertain. As Monsignor Angeli's natural heirs had made some difficulty about being disinherited, Alexander issued a brief whereby he took from every cardinal and every priest the right of making a will, and declared that all their property should fall to the Pope. One thing alone was wanting to assure the success of the projects that the Pope and his son were founding upon, the friendship of King Louis. That was money. But Alexander was not the man to be troubled about a paltry worry of that kind. True, the sale of benefices was now exhausted. The ordinary and extraordinary taxes had been collected for the year, and the prospect of more inheritance from cardinals and prelates was poor now that the richest of them had been poisoned. But Alexander had other means of raising money at his disposal. The first he employed was to spread a report that the Turks were threatening an invasion of Christendom, and that he knew for a positive fact that before the end of the summer, Bajazet would land 2 armies, one in Romagna and the other in Calabria. He therefore published 2 papal bulls, one to levy tithes of ecclesiastical revenues, levy tithes of all ecclesiastical revenues in Europe, of whatever nature they might be, the other to force the Jews to pay an equivalent sum. Both bulls contained the severest sentences against those who failed to submit or attempted opposition. The second plan was the selling of indulgence, a thing which had never been done before. These indulgences especially affected those who had who had been prevented by sickness or business from coming to Rome for the Jubilee. The journey was rendered unnecessary. Sins were pardoned by paying 1/3 of what the journey would cost. For gathering this tax, an army of tax collectors were instituted, with Ludovico della Torre at their head. The vast sum that Alexander gathered into the papal treasury is incalculable. Some idea of it may be gathered from the fact that 799,000 liveries in gold were paid by the territory of Venice alone. It happens that the Turks did make some sort of a demonstration from the Hungarian side, and the Venetians began to fear that they might be coming in their direction, so they asked help from the Pope. Thereupon he gave orders that an Ave Maria be said to pray God to protect the Venetians. This was the only help they got in exchange for the 799,000 liras in gold. Before he left Rome to complete the conquest of the Romagna, R-O-M-A-G-N-A, Romagna, Caesar Borgia, Duke of Valentinos, had been reflecting that the marriage between his sister Lucrezia and Alfonso had turned out quite useless to himself and his father. If Alfonso were only out of the way, Lucrezia would now be in position to marry some powerful lord of Ferrara or Brescia, who would be able to help his brother-in-law in the conquest of Romagna. Alfonso was not only useless, but also dangerous, which to a Borgia seemed worse. Therefore, Caesar decided that Alfonso should die. But Lucrezia's husband, who had realized for some time the risk he incurred by living near his terrible brother-in-law, the Pope, had retired to Naples. However, since neither Alexander nor Caesar had changed in their dissimulation towards him, he was beginning to lose fear. When he received an invitation from the Pope to take part in a bullfight in honor of Caesar before his departure, in the present precarious position of Naples, it would not have been good policy for Alfonso to afford Alexander any sort of pretext for a rupture, so he accepted the invitation to go to Rome, where he was received by the Pope and the Duke with every demonstration of friendship, and assigned to rooms in the Vatican. Great lists were prepared on the piazza of St. Peter's. The streets about it were barricaded, and the windows of the surrounding houses served as boxes for spectators. The Pope and his court took their places on the balconies of the Vatican in full view of the arena. The fete was started by professional toreadors. After these had exhibited their strength and skill, Alfonso and Caesar descended to the arena, and to offer a proof of their mutual friendship, agreed that the bull which pursued Caesar should be killed by Alfonso, and the bull that pursued Alfonso by Caesar. Caesar remained alone on horseback within the list, Alfonso going out by an improvised door, which was kept ajar, in order that he might go back on the instant if he judged that his presence was necessary. At the same time, from the opposite side of the list, the bull came forth and was immediately pierced with darts and arrows, some containing explosives, which took fire and maddened the bull so that he rolled in pain. Then arose in a fury, and perceiving Caesar on horseback, rushed upon him. Caesar displayed all the skill which proclaimed him one of the best horsemen of the period. Yet, clever as he was, he could not have remained long with an adversary against whom he had no recourse other than flight. Had not Alfonso suddenly appeared waving a red cloak in his left hand and holding in his right hand a long Argon sword, the bull was now only a few paces from Caesar, and the risk he was running was so imminent that a woman's scream was heard from one of the windows. At the sight of a man on foot, the bull stopped short, and judging that he could do better work with a new enemy, turned upon him. For a moment he stood motionless, roaring with pain, and lashing his sides with his tail. Then he rushed upon Alfonso, his eyes bloodshot, his horns tearing up the ground. Alfonso awaited him with a tranquil air. Then, when he was only 3 paces away, He made a bound to one side, and presented instead of his body his sword, and sunk it into the bowl. It sunk it to the hilt, into the bowl. Checked in his onslaught, stopped, trembled, fell upon his knees, uttered one dull roar, and breathed his last. And that, I think, is where we'll stop for part 2 of Little Blue Book number 66, Crimes of the Borgias. Jeez, they murder everybody. And we'll see you in part 3.